Hi, everyone. I'm Lori Baskin. I'm Director of Advocacy at TCG. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I would like to just note what an incredible time it's been. We're obviously just off a very polarizing and contentious election season, which indeed will affect how we do our advocacy going forward. But just to note that TCG is a nonpartisan organization and we do our advocacy in bipartisan fashion. So I want to welcome all of you. I would like to also do a land acknowledgement, as we've been doing traditionally at TCG conferences now for the last few years, but we'll start this session briefly. We want to recognize and respect Indigenous homelands. The connection to homelands has endured and is often central to cultural identity and worldview. This practice is about respecting and recognizing Indigenous peoples and their relationships to land through the protocols of naming people, elders, and ancestors. My home, where I've been working since March 13th, is near Peekskill, New York, on the lands once occupied by the Lenape and Wappinger peoples. The structure of this session is going to, after we do introductions, we're going to share some group agreements. We're going to go into some background on the demands, certain pieces of the demands. We're going to go into breakout rooms. This is a working session and we want to actually do some work together. We're going to have then group report outs and then discuss next steps. I just wanted to give that quick overview of the structure of our time together. We're together until 5 p.m. Eastern time. I am delighted to be working on this session together with Elena Chang, TCG's Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and Hannah Sharif, Artistic Director of the Repertory Theater of St. Louis, who is also a BIPOC member of TCG's board. And I'm honored and delighted to be doing this work together with Elena and Hannah. I think with that, unless I've left something out, we also could maybe start to show some of the slides, Sarah, and I'm going to ask everybody to drop into the Zoom your own introductions. There are far too many people to go around. We have 129 people, as it looks like on my screen. We're interested in your name, your pronouns, your theater affiliation, or if you're an individual artist, the location where you are, your native land, and perhaps a one-word check-in on how you're doing at this moment. And so let's go ahead and ask you to drop that into the chat. We can all ground with that and get to know each other a little bit, and then we'll move forward with our agenda. So thank you for going ahead and dropping that in the chat. Again, it's your name, your theater affiliation, your pronouns, your native land, and how you're doing in one word. I'm enjoying seeing the word. I'm already seeing hopeful several times. Thank you. Thank you all. I want to move us forward, and it gives me great pleasure to turn it over now to my colleague, Elena Chang, to walk us through some group agreements and to begin to frame out the session. Elena, over to you.
Thank you, Lori. Hi, my name is Elena, Director of ED&I Initiatives at TCG, she, her, hers. I am zooming in from Weehawken, New Jersey, land of the Lenape peoples. I'm a Korean American woman with mid-length brown, dark hair, partly tied back, and lots of eye makeup. Okay. So to kick us off, we have a few community agreements we'd like to throw into this space. Each of us enter into this conversation on a spectrum of experiences. And I definitely want to honor that. Some of us may be looking to support on how to disrupt harmful behavior in board meetings. Others might be needing some help on diversifying their boards with integrity. So let's just take a moment with these community agreements, and please feel free to add in the chat additional agreements that we should consider in the time that we have. Okay. I don't see everyone in the gallery, but can I get a quick show of hands or hand emojis via Zoom if we're good with these community agreements for this working session? Thank you, Harold. Okay. All right. So before we begin, a special loving shout out to Hannah Sharif for coming into this session after just holding it down with me and TCG COO Adrienne Boudou in the BIPOC Leaders Trustees Affinity Space. A bit of framing for today. As Lori's mentioned, this session will be a working session around trustee-specific We See You demands. Many of you may have seen the 30-something page document outlining demands. We See You White American Theater. And what we're hoping to do today is to focus on ways to disrupt and begin to activate paths toward meeting some of these demands. It is not going to be an end-all be-all. Anti-racist board leadership, especially now, is essential for organizations. I also want to take a moment to name that there are theaters of color nuances and needs as it relates to boards. So I want to encourage folks to keep in mind that it's never a one-size-fits-all. So for the last 8 months, many organizations have made their donations, posted across social media networks, worked on public-facing ED&I statements, hosted town halls and virtual meetings in various affinity. But how to ensure that anti-racist governance is here to stay, and that this work is not being embraced out of fear of being canceled, but rather responsibility towards civil rights in the arts. Oftentimes people like to start with some data points. So we're lucky to have our Director of Advocacy, Lori Baskin, here with us to help paint a bit of a picture, grounding us in some data points. And then we're going to hear very soon after from TCG board member Hannah Sharif. Lori?
Great, thank you. Thank you, Elena. So Sarah, let's see if we could please move forward one slide and we'll show, I think, some demands, but you can't read them. They're too small. And just know that we will be returning to the notion of which specific demands we're going to focus on today. But let's move forward one more slide, please. Okay. I don't know about your screen, but with the gallery of photos on one side and the chat on the other, I can't see too much of the screen, but maybe you all can. TCG periodically, we do annual surveys, and the structure of how we do our surveys may change going forward, but historically we have done an annual fiscal survey that results in theater facts and an annual salary survey, but we do periodic, what we call snapshot surveys. One of them focuses on governing boards, boards of our member theaters. The last governing board survey was actually quite a while ago. It's now 7 years ago, and it was conducted in 2013. I'm going to share a few bits of information from that survey because it is the most recent one that we have, and there isn't any other entity that looks at governing boards specifically from the nonprofit professional theater world. So I'll share a few bits of information from here and some other data points that we hope will just ground the conversations going forward. The surveys, just to note, the governing board surveys are not filled out by trustees. There's sort of no way for us to manage that or reach all trustees. Generally speaking, our surveys are sent to managing directors, and they in turn can either fill them out or send them to, depending on what the content of the survey is, some other appropriate person on staff, the finance director or whomever. But the governing board survey, just to note, has not been filled out by board members. It's been filled out by managing directors on behalf of the sort of organizational look at their governing boards. In this particular year, managing leaders were asked to collaborate with their board chairs in answering some of the more subjective survey questions, so that the information would reflect both views, but know that the information is not self-reported. Let's go to the next slide, please. On this slide, we've pulled some of the data that relates to the makeup, the racial makeup of boards, acknowledging that 116 theaters filled out the survey that year. So this is only representative of those theaters in that year, but I think it's an accurate snapshot. By and large, you can see that for all budget groups and then broken down by budget group, predominantly boards are made up of white people. There is some representation by Black people, smaller representation by Latinx people, Asian, and you can see going down the sheet there. Mostly boards are made up of white folks. Let's go to the next slide. And boards are almost 50-50, pretty much down the line on board members by gender. And yes, this does look at two choices in terms of gender, men and women. I don't know if at the time we asked anything different, to be honest, about gender, but capturing male and female, it was almost 50-50, pretty much straight down the line. Next slide, please. We asked managing directors, how important is it that your board represent the diversity of your community in terms of expertise, race and ethnicity, gender, age, and so on? And you can see that at least those top four categories, expertise, race and ethnicity, gender, and age, were all more than somewhat in terms of ratings and importance to that theater, to those theaters. So diversity ranks pretty high. Next slide, please. At the same time, and you'll see that these are ranked with number 1 at the top being highest ranked on down through number 7. These were the top considerations at the time from the perspective of the managing leader in terms of important considerations for board composition: access to wealth, community connections, expertise, then personal wealth, diversity is 5th, different perspectives, and prior nonprofit experience. Interesting makeup, and we'll probably want to come back to this as we go into our breakouts and discuss further. There's another element of the governing board survey that we thought would be particularly relevant to this conversation. Next slide, please, Sarah. Which is around board giving. And here we report on board giving policies and practices. Overall, 22% of responding theaters do not have a donation requirement. The remaining 78% have a give and or get requirement, and the following table summarizes the percentage of theaters in each budget group that have give and or get requirements. I would think that this is going to be pretty key in our conversations about how to think about boards and governance differently with respect to racial justice and anti-racist policies. So I would expect we'll be talking about this a bit in our breakout rooms. I also wanted to put a little bit of a lens of the financial impact of this global pandemic. And so I think this might be the last slide, Sarah. Financial losses. This information comes from Americans for the Arts. They've done research that looks at the whole arts sector. TCG did a survey in March, within the first few weeks to try and capture what was going on with member theaters financially as a direct result of the pandemic. That data is outdated and we have not had capacity to return to that. So hopefully again at some point. So I turned to Americans for the Arts. Financial losses to nonprofit arts and cultural organizations are now an estimated $14 billion. This was as of mid-October. It's pretty recent. 95% of artists and creative workers have lost income and 63% are fully unemployed. They expect to lose an average of $22,000 each in creativity-based income in 2020. Aggregate, that's over $50 billion nationally. 96% of organizations have canceled events, a loss of 478 million admissions and 15 billion in audience spending at local businesses, restaurants, and so forth. The total economic impact of organizational and audience spending losses is $4.9 billion in lost government revenue and 845,000 jobs no longer being supported. That means ancillary businesses are included, like restaurant workers and so forth. It's staggering, and yet we have a moment now, an important moment to address not only the challenges and stresses of COVID-19, but to make change in our organization so that when we come back better. So with that, I actually would like to now turn it we're so delighted to have our board member, Hannah Sharif, with us, who can give us her perspective on TCG board reflections and that experience, but also her own interactions at her own theater at the Repertory Theater of St. Louis. So thank you, Hannah, so much for being here, and we look forward to your thoughts and insights, which will help advance this conversation.
Thank you so much, Lori, and it's great to be with all of you. Lovely to see so many colleagues in the room. I'm coming to you from the land of the Kickapoo and Miami indigenous peoples, also known as St. Louis, Missouri. And I'm really grateful to be part of this conversation around the issues of governance. I want to start by actually going back and reflecting on something that the president of our board, Nicole Salter, shared in the opening session, which is this very real notion that TCG is not exempt from the work of reevaluating ourselves as a governing body, reevaluating the hierarchy and practices of the historic hierarchy and practices of our service organization. I think it's a really important thing for us to start with, because I think even in my own history, TCG has often been looked at as the largest service organization for our field, as an organization that we can go to for the answers. And this group, this moment is not about TCG being able to offer the answers, because TCG doesn't have the answers. We are deeply dedicated as a board in doing the assessment, the self-assessment, the evaluation, and asking the rigorous, difficult questions of ourselves and of the field. And we are dedicated to creating space for us to work as a collective in the brain trust of working to address these questions and these issues for the field and for ourselves. So I thank you all for being willing to roll up your sleeves and join in a meaningful way in this deconstruction and self-evaluation. TCG right now is looking at our own makeup. We're in the thick of a strategic planning session. We're looking at new strategic priorities, and those priorities include centering the voices and needs of BIPOC artists, which is a very specific lens, and one that has brought to the surface, I think, many questions. We are all working through our own unconscious biases and coming to the table, I think, with great intentionality and an openness for rigorous discourse. I would highlight that this work is not easy work, that it requires an interesting mix of contradictions, of fortitude and vulnerability. And first and foremost, the idea that we are not going to happenstance our way into equity. We're not going to happenstance our way into an inclusive new American theater. And we're not going to happenstance our way into a diverse landscape. If it were possible, it would have already happened for our field. So recognizing that this work is intentional work, it is hard work, it is work that will challenge our notion of ourselves. And that doesn't matter what your ethnicity, race, gender, whatever demographics, whatever your intersectionality is, all of it will be tested by the work ahead. And so recognizing that, knowing that, honoring that, and choosing still to put our energy, our time, and our investment into this work, because it ultimately is about the sustainability in the future of our specific institutions and of the field that all of us on this call have dedicated so much of our lives towards. We have just had the opportunity to walk through some very real data. And I thank you, Lori, for sharing those slides. But I also want to remind us that those data points are a snapshot of the field, but they're a snapshot through a very specific lens, which is the lens that we have always seen ROI through. And I want to challenge us to hold on to what comes up from looking at that snapshot of the field, but also to not let that be the center of the work ahead. That in actuality, what we really want to do is lean into what is our intention with this work? What are the intentions of our organization? What are our values? How do we root every decision that we are making in our values? How do we allow our values to be the metric system for ourselves as executive leaders and trustees of our institutions? Allow our values to be the metric system for the work that we produce and the people that we serve, and the way that we show up in national community to push the field forward. ROI based on values is one of the things I am challenging myself in my own institution to think about, and I offer as a provocative challenge to all of us who are on this call and about to do this work together. I want to share a bit as an artistic director of a regional theater, PWI, that this summer, like so many of us on this call, my inbox dinged and there was an email from a collective, an anonymous collective, We See You White American Theater, with a link to a 31-page list of demands and a call to action, a call for the executive leadership of our institution and the leadership of our board to respond to the demands list that was incredibly comprehensive. I can't even imagine how many hundreds of hours of time went into the curation of that document. And I think it, to be completely candid, it was both a surprise and I think a moment of like pulling up. Some have framed it within my organization as being taken aback by the tone for some people of the document and the demands, by the exhaustive nature of it, by some of the issues that seem very foreign and distant. And, you know, I received that email. My partner, who I think is here, Mark Bernstein, my managing director, received that email. We shared the document with the president of our board, who is also here. And over the course of the last few months, as a staff, the senior management of our institution, we have been moving through this work. And I will share that my institution in particular, we were not ready to dive directly into the demands when we received them. There was preparation that needed to happen in the senior management team just for us to have common language and common ground to open the document. So we chose to use a book as a resource to guide our senior management through and make sure that we had a common understanding of certain terminologies. We used the book, This Book is Anti-Racist by Tiffany Jewell, which was actually written for young people. So it had a very low barrier in terms of how it would challenge us. And it really was a kind of personal journey that each member of our management team took. And over the course of working through that book, we were able to actually talk about some of the terms and to come to a common understanding that would allow us to even begin the work of deconstructing that exhaustive 31-page demands list. I'm sharing, and I don't believe I'm sharing out of turn. Just last week, we had an executive board meeting. And during the last couple of months, Mark and I have been working directly with our senior management team, but had not been in active conversation with our board leadership around the We See You document. 3 of my board members are currently in the current class of the Arts Equity board training program. So I don't know if there are any other folks here on the call who are part of that program. But during that program, they have independently been working as part of the Arts Equity Board training program through this document as well. And so last week we had an executive board meeting at which the president of our board, the vice president of our board, and the chair of our development committee, who are all in this training, introduced the demands to our full executive board. And I will tell you, it was a profound moment for me because I had not engaged in a conversation before that executive meeting with my board leadership. I wanted to understand and hear from their perspective how they had processed that document without having weighted the scale with my hand in any way. And I think part of the reason why I made that decision, to be completely frank, is because I'm a BIPOC executive leader. And the issues of race can be very triggering. And I wanted and needed to see what our starting place was. And I was actually really profoundly moved by the way the document was introduced to our executive committee. One of our trustees, they were very clear, very candid. They talked about the fact that they were going to be introducing a document that as people read it, may take them aback because we're used to policing the tone of BIPOC folks, and that the demands were intentionally written to be provocative, to push. They were not gentle requests. And so there was this framing that, well, when you first read this, you may have these feelings. We had these feelings. But then there was this moment where one of my trustees asked the executive committee to reframe whatever their initial impulses might be and think about these demands as a love letter to the American theater, coming to us from a group of people who are incredibly invested and dedicated to the future of the theater, and encouraged us to really think about the evolution of our country, of this moment that we're in, of the history of our field, and to try and contextualize it outside of the initial impulses and feelings that it might bring up. One of the things that I have used with my own department heads is to say, yes, this is a document that is speaking to BIPOC issues, but we should also recognize that if we're actually able to work through the issues of this document, we will have worked through the issues of oppression for our entire field. Because there's intersectionality for all people within this document. And the other thing I would share is this very clear notion that for my institution, the demands are not a checklist. It's not a, this is the demand, let's check the box. The demands are a way of provocating necessary, intense, rigorous discourse about our values as an organization, about who and how we serve our community, about how we want to show up in the world and what our mission is and how we're going to actualize that, about how we have been complicit and how we can use the platform we have to break cycles of inequity and oppression in our city, in our region, in our field. This is an anti-oppression document. This is a liberation document. And as my board member said, this document is a love letter to the American theater, and that we all have a certain responsibility, at the very least, to move with clear intentionality. I also feel in some ways that there's less of a value judgment on the decisions that an institution makes, as long as those decisions are made with clarity, with intentionality, and with accountability. So if you're going to be an organization that says, we're not interested in taking on this anti-racist work, let that decision be made with clarity, with intentionality, and with accountability. I am excited to do this work with all of you, and so pleased to be partnering with Lori and Elena on this session. We've talked about this 31-page document, but what we're going to be looking at actually is a much narrower lens. We're going to look at the demands that directly address governance, and hopefully we'll be able to make some traction and share with each other meaningful steps forward. And with that, I'd love to turn it over to Elena.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Actually, in the time that we have, we will get to the breakouts. Lori, I'm going to toss it back to you to offer a bit of framing. And we have the slides with the 5 demands that we did pull out. So again, friends, this is a working session. Lori, I'll pass it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Hannah, and thank you, Elena. So yeah, we're gonna go in a few minutes into 5 breakouts. I acknowledge that we now have 144 people in this session. The breakouts are not gonna be 4 people, they're gonna be a bit bigger than that. But we wanna focus on 5 topics, 5 specific demands that relate to governance issues and governing boards. I'm gonna read them because I think it's faster. If we were in a room together, I'd call on people and have people join me in reading them out loud. But these are the items that we felt we should focus on today. And then I'm gonna offer some context after that, some prompt questions to think about as you move into the rooms. The first one, that you create transparency around institutional expectations, logistics, and requirements, and be prepared to embrace the possibility of the BIPOC artists in the boardroom asking for amendments and changes to those institutional expectations. 2, and we're going to break into groups. That group number 1 addresses the first one that I just read. Group number 2 will address this demand. We demand the immediate removal of racist board members and those who have exhibited racist behavior. 3, the third group will focus on eliminate mandatory financial minimum gifts for board membership. The 4th group will focus on this demand: deprioritize outsized monetary influence in board decisions and prioritize valuing the voices and skills of BIPOC board members, honor cultural competency, relationship building, and lived experiences. And the 5th group will focus on recognizing that artists are essential to boards, amend bylaws to require that executive committees must include BIPOC artists. And next slide, please. These are the kinds of things we'd like you to think about as you're discussing those particular demands. What is the candid potential fallout in your community from moving into this practice? How do you position this new philosophical shift and institutional practice to your key stakeholders? Do minimum financial minimums actually serve your organizations? How many board members sort of live at that minimum with the capacity to give more? How are you doing the baseline work of educating yourself and your fellow trustees to be able to approach the issues before you? What common language and values are leading you in your deconstruction and rigorous institutional self-assessment? So I think that we are going to be able to drop, I think that they already did. Somebody, one of my colleagues did drop the all of what I just read into the chat. So you will be able to see that when you go into breakouts.
Hey, Lori.
Yeah.
Hey, this is Sarah. I'm also about to drop into the chat a PDF that is on a Google Drive because I can't just share documents. So it's a PDF, but it's on Google Drive of all of the slides that we've looked at today so far. So you can reference them as you go into your breakout rooms. And so these prompt questions and the breakout room demands will be in this as well.
Sarah, as long as we're talking about things that you're dropping into the chat, we talked about setting up a Google spreadsheet for people to drop in their names and email addresses from this session, so that if they have questions or we want to be able to reach this group in the future, we could do that. So if you're able to drop that in, I don't want to wait to the end of the session for that. I'm going to ask everybody to please, if you want to stay in touch on this work, please drop in your name and email address. But now if we could just sort of see the screen again, I need your help, everybody. Hannah will lead one of these 5 groups, and I will be in another one of those rooms. I'm looking for, I guess, 3 more volunteers. So Sarah, could we stop screen sharing for just a moment, please, and let me see the room? Or at least there are 6 pages of 6 screens of people, so I won't be able to see raised hands. If you are interested in helping to sort of facilitate, it's not heavy facilitation, but I need somebody in each of the different breakout rooms who will try and capture or keep the conversation flowing. It doesn't have to be that person who captures notes or areas to focus on, ideas that come forward. I'm looking for, are you all dropping your names and email addresses in the chat because of what I just asked in terms of name and email address? That goes in the Google Doc that Sarah linked in the contact sheet. If you're interested in facilitating, I'm looking for only 3 facilitators, not names and email addresses here. So please tell me in the chat if you're willing to facilitate. Don't volunteer at once. I'm looking for 3 volunteers, please. I don't know if that's Evie or Evie, but thank you very much, Sarah. I see 1 person there. We have 3, Mark Bernstein and Mar-Ellen. We've got 3 and we can stop there. I'm taking the first 3 up. Sarah, you see them?
Yes, give me 1 second just to move.
Yep. So I know that it takes a minute or 2. There's a lot of behind the scenes when you take a Zoom group and move people into breakouts. It is going to be a random assignment. Unfortunately, I'm not going to let you pick because that would take way too much time to assign people to specific topics. So we're going to ask you to graciously go in whichever room you're assigned, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and tackle those particular demands with the lens that I shared. And when Sarah is ready to do that and send people off, we will let you know. So we've got
I believe that we are ready. Okay, it looks like everybody's back.
Great, thank you so much. So everyone is back or awkwardly interrupted mid-sentence, so we can just hold that and be okay with it for today. Thank you everyone for participating in the breakouts. We're going to take a few minutes now to hear reflections from each group. I'm not sure if there's a designated person to report out, but I'll go demand by demand. I'll call out the number and offer this space as an opportunity for folks to popcorn in. We'll hear from each group as Lori synthesizes the notes to share before we close out. All right. So let's start with number 1. That you create transparency around institutional expectations, logistics, and requirements, and be prepared to embrace the possibility of the BIPOC artists in the boardroom asking for amendments and changes to those institutional expectations.
Hi, I'm Kate. I was the note taker for group one, so I'll go through some quick things, but please, anyone else in my group, feel free to jump in if I'm misstating or omitting important things. We talked predominantly about what the experience of inviting BIPOC artists into the boardroom is like, and how we avoid tokenism of having only a small number of BIPOC folks in an otherwise white room. We talked about creating spaces that are safe or brave, and stopping is a comment that came right at the end of the conversation, which I think I at least really appreciated, was about not thinking of this sort of magical group of BIPOC artists and we as a bunch of white people need to create a space for them, but of identifying actual individual human beings and talking to them about what they need to be a part of this conversation in a meaningful way. And we also talked about thinking about the architecture of our boardrooms, not the rooms themselves, but about how we structure decision making and the process of being part of those decision making, and how can we dismantle that. And that this model that we are currently working under is built on colonialist structures, and it's not about creating small incremental changes, but about using this time when we can't produce to blow up this model and build something new. So that was what I had in my notes, but I welcome any other input from anyone else in our group.
Well done, Kate. Thank you so much. We're not going to ask you in this moment to provide a timeline for all of those things, clearly, but really taking in the note about importance to take a pause, to reflect, and, you know, very much thinking that this is not about BIPOC unicorns, as much as we want to prioritize BIPOC artists. Like, how could we do that with intentionality? Thank you. Group two. Oh, this is an interesting one. We demand the immediate removal of racist board members and those who have exhibited racist behavior. Group two, let's hear it.
This is Lori. I took notes. I don't know if anybody else wants to speak up from group two. Speak now, please. Okay, I'm going to share some of what I captured, but if people have other stuff they want to add, please jump in. There was a lot of discussion around what constitutes a racist board member, that there needs to be a definition, that are isolated instances of racism, which we all exhibit. Is that enough to remove somebody from the board? So, you know, or is it more thinking about an education process and training and that sort of thing? People talked about wanting to keep those people in the mix and take them on this journey with us rather than immediately, as the demand says, casting them off. And yet, then there were conversations around that the country is based on money, and how would you let go? You know, will the money piece win out rather than letting somebody go who's been a big contributor? What's going to be the be all and end all? So it was, do you hold that person dear and bring them along on the journey? Do you get rid of them? What's the line that defines racist or not racist behavior, or racist enough? And then I think that there was an acknowledgement that, as Hannah said earlier on, that the demands were put in a very deliberately provocative language to really force this conversation. And I kind of asked the room at the end, but if somebody is really entrenched in this bad behavior and they are standing in the way, as I think Gail Lopes said, if they're standing in the way of progress, would you be willing to cut them loose? And I think virtually everybody raised their hand. So I think there are structures in place to remove difficult board members, and people would employ those tactics if need be. But I think that it was not an easy conversation. Does anybody else want to jump in?
Okay, thank you so much, Lori. You know, it is interesting because even in the opening plenary today, there was talk of capitalism and numbers. Hannah pointed to some of the data points that Lori presented as well. And it is very interesting how this group seems to have more questions than offerings. And again, that is fine, because when we started the session, we said that we're all coming in from different perspectives, experiences, and on a spectrum of even definitions. So this call and this request for definitions, I just want to note, I also want to note this piece around money and how we may put a lot of pressure on ourselves and thinking about individuals and how that comes into play. There are tactics. I mean, there are strategies, and there is no playbook for that. But I will share that if definitions are what is needed, that is a concrete area where there are so many resources out there and trainings. And in addition to those trainings and resources, it is really important for us to continue to have this conversation, even if these conversations are difficult. And then in terms of tactics, I can't say there's an app for that, but in the closing, Lori, hopefully you'll be able to share a little bit about the ways that we could continue to stay connected. I mean, folks, we're here for the long haul, right? And I really appreciate, you know, the questions from group 2. Let us go into group 3, eliminate mandatory financial minimum gifts for board membership. I love this demand, but I also want to lift that in other spaces, there's also a question of how to do this in a way that doesn't feed into stereotypes and assumptions, right? Okay, so group 3.
I took notes for our group. We had a very good discussion, lots of suggestions on the table. I'm going to start with the philosophical question that came up, which is that we should all consider what is the board for, and what would happen if we built our boards to be a stakeholder board rather than a philanthropic board. So I thought that was an interesting way to frame the question. We had several people who suggested ideas around the subject of revenue diversification, that if we could develop other revenue streams, we might be able to move away from a model that relies on philanthropic support from the board. One person pointed out that minimums aren't always enforced, and therefore they may not really be accomplishing what we think they're accomplishing anyway. The suggestion was brought up, and I think this is a fairly common one, that we should ask people to give within their own capacity, that and ask them to make our board one of their top 3 gifts rather than specifying a dollar amount. There was also a suggestion that when speaking to board members about their giving, we could promote what the board average is, or what the board median giving is. This is actually a suggestion that we've used at times in conversations with people, rather than a minimum amount. There was a suggestion from one theater that they are moving to a tiered system in which there would be multiple ways that board members can opt to contribute, both financial and non-financial. So it's moving away from a totally financially based requirement. There was a statement that we should not assume that BIPOC board members do not have the capacity, that in and of itself is implicitly racist. And finally, that from one theater that had removed their giving requirements, the cautionary statement that if you do that, it's very important to have a clear articulation of your expectations. So that's what came up in our discussion. I would ask if the group wanted to add anything.
All right. Is there somebody else that wanted to add from that group? Okay. Here we go. I'm going to pull this out here. Group number 4, deprioritize outsized monetary influence in board decisions and prioritize valuing the voices and skills of BIPOC board members. Honor cultural competency, relationship building, and lived experiences.
Hello, Themby Duncan coming from Buffalo, New York, Shays Performing Arts Center. I took notes for that group. We started off spending some time discussing various interpretations of the statement itself, and then we moved on to some action items. We talked about experimenting with interrogating the language of that we use around board trusteeship, the idea of a board and what we all know that to be, being in this industry, and thinking about ideas like cheerleaders, accomplices, advocates. We had mention of the idea of a job fair, if you will, like a board fair, reaching out to people in ways that don't already isolate them or make them feel like there's an expectation that they can't meet that would potentially keep them from exploring the idea. We also talked about a local foundation in Syracuse where they match make between nonprofits and potential new trustees. And I've heard of that in some spaces. So I encourage you to drop the URLs of various organizations that do that. And Jill Anderson, I'll ask if you don't mind dropping in the URL for the Gifford Foundation at this time. Just a way of thinking about, okay, are there organizations that are already doing this work that we need to make sure we're connecting in with and supporting? And Jill also mentioned that all trustees on their board in Syracuse spend their first year on the finance committee. So some sort of a level setting of getting everybody, whether they're an artist or a finance person or otherwise, to have an understanding of the finances of that particular organization. Because as we know, one nonprofit is one nonprofit, the next is possibly completely different. And you may have worked at several nonprofits, but it doesn't mean you're going to understand the way the financial workings are on the next one. So we talked about bringing in BIPOC folks who are not the sort of diversity person, the person that's focusing on ideas, and bringing in BIPOC finance people and legal people and finding them through BIPOC organizations that support them, like a Black Bar Association or for instance, an Asian American Accountants Association, going to those kinds of resources for people in areas that, quite frankly, theater doesn't traditionally see people of color in willfully, and they exist. They're just in the business sector. And finally, a question was sent to me from our group just before we came on here. Does deprioritizing outsized monetary influence also include grappling with the fact that we ask board members to do their work for free? Not everyone can afford to donate their labor to the organization as much as they might want to. And the question is also, BIPOC artists and otherwise, when we want to bring artists on the board to contribute, can they afford to volunteer that service, and or is it fair to ask that of them? Please, anyone else, feel free to add anything that I missed.
I thought that was a really great summary, and also you added a lot of other important information. So thank you. The only other thing that I wanted to add was just, we had a conversation about, centering BIPOC people and how to make sure we are not marginalized. And we can't center BIPOC people if we don't have enough. So we need to have more BIPOC people on boards so that they're not marginalized, into just the EDI committee, which is an important committee, but that, we have a lot more to contribute.
Wonderful, thank you. So more BIPOC people, but not with scrambled BIPOC outreach. Thank you. For our last group here, we have recognizing that artists are essential to boards, amend bylaws to require that executive committees must include BIPOC artists.
I'm Mary Ellen Ahern. I'm president of the board of the Contemporary American Theater Festival in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. I think that it kind of, our group, and if anybody wants to contribute, please just jump in. It ended up focusing really about two areas. And the first discussion was around the financial needs and doing away with financial minimums for a membership on the board. And it really reflected a lot of what the other groups had said so far. A number of organizations had eliminated their financial minimum and instead asked that the gift that be given by board members be among the top 3 of their charitable gifts. There was an example within the group of a theater whose board's responsibility almost solely is giving money and getting money. And the question really is in that kind of situation when the priority is there for the board, how do you attract people that may not have the resources, and how do you make them feel as though they're valuable to the board? The second piece of the discussion really was around policies. And I think one of the real interesting things that came up was the statement was essentially that you can honor the intent of what the demand is, but in doing so, you have to really avoid that other problems might get created. And we didn't have a lot of time to flesh that out, but I thought that was a pretty interesting observation. I think in terms of bringing board members on, one of the recommendations was, treat bringing an artist on board like you would anyone, and make sure that you look at, you just assess what the skill sets are of the people that you're recruiting, and bring them on like you would any other board members. Some of the other views on it were that we have to make sure that we're not tokenizing people, and that the executive committee and the artistic staff make sure that they make artists feel as though they're really an essential and wanted participant in the board, and that they're very much an equal member of the board. And I think some of that was in reference to when you have a give and get kind of policy on the board, if you bring someone in who can't give or get at the same rate as other people, that may serve to kind of put them in a lesser position. So to really work against that. And one of the topics that came up was when you have an artist involved in a theater, do you anticipate any conflicts of interest around that artist maybe working with that theater? And I think the general feeling about that was that there's no policy really around that, but you really have to use your judgment and know the person that you're bringing on, and that they fit with the board, and they recognize their responsibility, and you jointly recognize how you would deal with the situation. Did I miss anything from anybody else in the group? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to be mindful of time. We're always running out of time, whether it's in the breakouts or in the actual sessions. Time is also a construct that was mentioned in a previous session. I'm hearing a lot of themes and areas of heat from these breakout spaces, and I hope the conversations may inform future work with a larger group of trustees for longer term planning. There's certainly power and privilege in this room. Many of us who've been to fall forums, we've had conversations around that. And what will it look like to leverage that toward anti-racist civic responsibility? You all here in this session because you want to lean into this work, and TCG will continue to support conversation amongst peers and connecting with other theaters, researching various case studies and models. Really quickly, Sarah, can you share the contact list Google Doc once more in the chat? Again, this is for those in this session interested in connecting with other folks here today, as well as receiving updates on future anti-racist governance work. I hear a lot of questions, but there's also a lot of excitement and heat in the chat around learning from each other and exploring tactics and not having the same conversation over and over again. So whether it is seeking out the resources and training opportunities, or being able to really see examples of what have been working in some of these lovely ideas, let's get to it, folks. Over the next few months, over the next few years, I mentioned long haul. It's a serious thing. Lori, I want to pass it over to you to give us a quick synthesis, and then perhaps tell us a little bit about the circle and next steps.
Honestly, thank you so much, Elena. I don't know that we need a synthesis. I think that each of the groups reported out beautifully, and that, as you said, there was a lot of really good heat around some very important topics, even if it's finding definitions and just beginning the conversations, or if it's moving along on these areas. I did hear a lot of conversation around minimum gifts, top 3 priorities, including how to include artists on the board. There were so many important topics. I don't want to sort of diminish it in the last minute. I just loved what you said, Elena, anti-racist civic responsibility. I think if we could all move forward with that mantle from this room, that would be just great. Please do continue the conversations in your theaters, and also know that there is a trustee leadership network group on the TCG circle. They exchange emails, but more importantly, I see Cynthia Hoffman on this call, and I don't know if, or Zoom, I don't know if Tim Hibbish is here as well, but the two of them have been sort of co-chairing every other week conversations. They call them happy hours, though I've not yet seen a drink. But anyway, I think it's generally on Thursdays. Sarah's laughing. This week it's going to be Friday to close out the fall forum. So there is a sort of a bridge between this convening and the Trustee Leadership Network every other week conversations. It's a great place to continue these conversations, and we urge that. This is a process. It's not we're not expecting outcomes by Friday. We hope we're all, wherever you've started on this journey, that we're moving it further along together. Thank you so much for being here, being together, and approaching this with openness and joy. And so I am wondering, Sarah or somebody, Jen, if anybody could sort of share what's the next thing on the agenda for today, and otherwise back tomorrow. But I think that there might be. I just wanted to leave you all with that.
We have one more plenary session today. It'll start at 5:15, so take a quick break and then come on back to just close out our
That's right,
table
the closing
talks.
session, and then there are happy hours. A BIPOC happy hour. Thank you all. Thanks to Hannah. It was
Yes.
wonderful to have your insights, and Elena, and all the partnership of all the TCG staff online. And thank you to all of you for being here today. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.